Hey photographers, welcome back to the studio. We're going to begin our photo collage, our sort of magical realism project with some actual collaging. So we've got some sort of magazine or newspaper around, and here's sort of what you're looking for. A collection of images that you're sort of interested in and attracted to. A couple basic ideas would be something like alternative portraiture, right? If you've got a magazine, there's probably tons of advertising photography in it. Go ahead and pull something else. The portrait I'm pulling here has a nice strong edge on the outside that's going to make actually cutting a little bit easier, paying attention to that hard edge. As you're kind of paging through whatever magazine or newspaper you've got, consider a couple of other ideas, right? Objects. Objects usually, especially advertising objects, have a real strong edge with them. As you're paging through, look for maybe environments, right? Environmental images, something that could operate something maybe a little bit like a background. That's not going to require quite as much cutting, but it will provide some interesting stuff in Photoshop in a little bit. And then maybe a couple things that you want to like stay away from or just be careful about. Really rough, complicated edges, things like hair, right? You really don't want to have to cut with a razor blade or cut with the scissors around really complex, small details. Some other things that you should maybe avoid would be objects that have a lot of text in them. I don't want you guys to think about this so much as like a graphic design or typography project. I really want us to deal primarily with images, so be careful about choosing images that have too much text. We're not trying to recreate advertisements. We're actually trying to work with the photographic images that are inside of the objects. Textures and patterns, right, might be kind of interesting, or colors, right? I was sort of looking at the difference in color here, or the kind of analog in color between these this blue jean advertisement and this kind of environmental image. That might be something interesting to sort of play with. One sort of potential problem, right, as we're thinking about cutting these things out, is if you end up with something that's a little bit too complex, a little bit too intricate. If you have access to something like an X-Acto blade, you can really cut out some very precise things. But without the X-Acto blade, working with the scissors, cutting along the edge of, say, really complicated cuts in and around objects that are, trying to cut out really, really small things. Maybe try to avoid that and work with just some larger forms. So I'm going to work with these ones here, just do a couple of basic cutouts, and then I'm going to photograph them and pull them into Photoshop. If you have access to something like an X-Acto blade, doing really careful cuts around hard objects will be nice. And there is an analog in Photoshop that we'll use to this type of tool. I'll just kind of give a brief demonstration on how I might kind of carefully remove along the edges of an object here with an X-Acto blade. I'm cutting through a thin piece of paper, and whatever's underneath is going to end up getting cut up by the blade. And so I use either a scrap piece of cardboard or a scrap piece of wood. That way the blade doesn't end up messing up a tabletop or something like that. I'm really carefully trying to cut right along the photographic edge here. And I can get get an eye in really, really close along there. But one of the things that when I notice is that as I'm cutting, right, my attention sort of fatigues, and so I do these things called relief cuts, where eventually, as my focus starts to drain, I'll just kind of like cut off to the edge, and that sort of relieves the edge of that cut, and I can come back in and get a little bit closer. If you don't have something like an X-Acto blade, and all you have is a scissors at home, you should be able to just as easily do this kind of work. What I generally think about when I'm using a scissors is take a look at the edge of the blades, right? If the blade edges are really fouled or dirty or full of all kinds of glue or something, they're not going to cut very well on the paper. Also, you'll only usually about the first inch or so of a scissor blade is where I want to do most of my work. Way out here at the tip, I don't really have very much control, and so I'm going to keep all of my cuts sort of back to the back edge of the scissors. And once I kind of get far enough, I reset the scissor blade and continue that cutting. So all along the edge here, I don't know if you can easily see that in the video, but I have some extra bits that I missed. Maybe I wasn't focusing really carefully. I could go back in and carefully sort of snip out any of those areas that I missed. But for our photographic process, that may not be much of an issue. In fact, it may show off a little bit of the sort of handcrafted nature of this photograph. So you don't have to fuss too hard over any of those little missed areas. I'm going to come in and remove just some of the larger white ones for this photographic background. Now, for objects, right, some of these may be even a little bit easier. This sort of set of blue jeans here should be able to fairly easily cut right along the edges inside those seams. And finally, this background sheet, I think I'll probably sort of leave it as is, but I'm going to remove some of this lower area here, just because I know that I'm not interested in working with the image of the person floating in there. I'll slice that off. Okay, so I've got at least 3 images to work with, something like a background and a couple of objects that have been carefully cut along the edges. In order to get these images digitalized, let's rephotograph them right here in our space. It's probably easiest if you're doing this in an area with some good natural lighting, but the only other thing would be make sure that whatever the background is, that it's a nice even consistent color. This checkered background is not the greatest. I'm going to look for something like a simple white background or maybe a simple gray background so that when I rephotograph these, I'll be able to really easily find the edge in Photoshop. When you're choosing some backgrounds to rephotograph against, just choose something that's a really obvious contrast between the original photograph and the background. That way Photoshop will be able to easily differentiate between the image and the background.